Looks like we have a few people coming into the webinar now, so we'll give it a few moments here before we start. Hi, everyone. Looks like we have a few people who found themselves into the room. Welcome. But looks like we still have a bunch more coming over, so we'll give it a few moments here. If you've joined, welcome. Looks like we've got about a dozen people in the room so far, and so we'll give it here a few more moments before we get going. And as Felicia reminds us, you'll be able to ask questions via chat here in Zoom and also on the Pathable chat. If we don't get to your question, we'll register it and try to get back to you in some way with a response. My name is Kevin Dooley. Welcome to the TSC Summit, and now going on, I think, our 12th year of having a summit. Welcome, old friends, and hello, new friends. I am so honored here to be with a distinguished panel of experts who are going to talk to us about where the world is at right now with respect to sustainability and resiliency from the perspective of the stakeholders that they engage with most directly. So my name is Kevin Dooley again. I'm Chief Scientist at TSC. We're going to be talking about resilient supply chains, perspectives from corporate investors and consumers. We have Kelly Fisher, Head of Corporate Sustainability at HSBC, Arti Ramachandran, Director of Research and Engagements at FAIR, and Randy Kranthal-Sacco at the New York University Stern Center for Sustainable Business, where she is a Senior Scholar of Marketing and Corporate Outreach. And so I'm going to start with Kelly, and then we'll go to Arti and Randy. And maybe you could say a little bit more about your organization's role in sustainability, and then answer the question, what does resiliency mean for your particular stakeholder that you interact with? And what should we expect moving forward in this post-COVID market? So we'll start with Kelly.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so pleased to be here and so honored to be with Randy and Arti. So thank you, as well as you, Kevin. So I'm the head of corporate sustainability for HSBC Bank in the US. And We have been recognized numerous times over the past years as a leading bank globally for sustainable finance. So I'm going to take the corporate view today and leave the investors and the consumers to my incredible colleagues here on the webinar. What I've seen for the past year, and it has been obviously a year like no other. A lot of it has been gleaned from my experiences talking to our corporate clients, as well as a research report that we came out with you, Kevin and Christy, at the height of the pandemic. We started talking to you about doing a report on resilient supply chains and released it in April of 2020. We did not know how incredibly relevant it was going to be. So what I've seen from that and from the conversations I have is that a resilient company is more than a resilient supply chain. It's resilient senior leadership. It's resilient employees. And when I think about our CEO here in the US, Michael Roberts, who joined us from Citibank only a few months before the COVID pandemic started, he's to me the pinnacle of what a resilient, calm, focused leader looks like, who isn't looking at the next year, who's looking at the long term. And he always jokes with me, don't ever hire anyone and give them the title, head of ESG, because I'm the head of ESG. He calls himself that. And that's incredibly powerful. So the good news, there's been a lot of evidence the past year that companies with a long-term sustainably focused strategy have weathered the past year better. Including HSBC, we were the first to market with research that showed that ESG stocks were outperforming the others during the volatility of the market, right? Last April. So I think that shows that companies that are resilient and long-term focused are the ones that are going to weather this very, very well. Even better for us is I went from having to wedge myself in financial conversations with our corporate clients last year to our corporate clients pounding on my door this year and our relationship managers. I think the number of conversations I have with clients now about sustainable finance solutions and ESG has quadrupled so far this year. Even better for me, they want to talk as much about the S of ESG. It used to be about GHG emissions and green bonds and green loans. Now they want to talk about the new social loans or social supply chain finance or things like that. That's been really meaningful to me. And so to me, that leads to the two things I want to leave you with as we start this discussion. One is that I think in order for companies to succeed from this point forward, everything has to go through an ESG lens. That we all have to consider climate change and the fight for greater equity and human rights in everything we do. If you want to succeed and you want to be a company like HSBC, we've been around for 157 years. If you want longevity, you have to do that. And then lastly, we need to stop thinking of them as separate. I think that the E and the S are tied intricately to each other. And if we keep separating them as different issues, that's going to be a problem. So I'll end there and turn it over to one of my amazing panelists.
Thank you, Kelly. Artie?
Great. Well, thank you to you all, and thank you, Kevin. Well, I think just very quickly, FAIR is a network of institutional investors. So we provide research and facilitate collaborative investor engagements for our sort of institutional investor membership on primarily sort of on the sector of protein. So we cover conventional protein production, alternative protein production from an ESG risk and opportunity perspective. So I think this past year, sort of echoing what Kelly has said as well, which is that for investors, when you talk about resiliency in the traditional context, what we've seen is, they're talking about being more risk aware, making sure they have deliver consistent returns across different market cycles, and the sort of power of sustainable investing, however imperfectly it's being implemented today, is that it really does help to solidify some of these attributes and contributes to resiliency. So I'll talk about it in the case of the protein sector, which is what we cover primarily through our work with investors. So when we started FAIR about 5 years ago, the sort of the conventional way of looking at the animal protein sector was primarily sort of the conventional factors that investors typically use, right? So cash flows, earnings, dividends. And really the fundamental thesis was that this was a sector that was growing. Consumption was going to accelerate because of demographic trends. And this was a good place to see some returns. But from our perspective, and we think that lens is quite constraining, because obviously there are a range and array of risks and opportunities that investors miss out on because they're not considering the whole picture that protein consumption and production sort of entails. Let's talk about it from a risk perspective, for example. The protein sector, wherever you sort of fall in the value chain, but the fact of the matter is that today animal protein production is it's underregulated. It's a sector. And this is especially material given that it is the number of sort of negative externalities associated with animal protein production. And so, there is going to be a market correction. There will be growing regulation, and we're already seeing that sort of play out in different markets. So, for example, in New Zealand, pricing scheme that will focus particularly on reducing methane emissions from their dairy and meat sector. Similarly, in Netherlands, which is a big pig producer, ammonia emissions are a big issue, so they're targeting the pig farming industry there. And of course, in the US, you've seen multiple lawsuits play out. For example, sort of about 22 lawsuits that targeted nuisance lawsuits that targeted Smithfield Foods. And so we're seeing the slow escalation of liability and regulatory risk, and we're expecting to see that increase. And for investors, this will obviously have an impact on company bottom lines. It's going to end up with sudden negative cash events. It's going to increase capex expenditures, opex expenditures. So these are all sort of areas that if an investor is not paying attention to, they're sort of going to miss out on the fact that a company that is not addressing these risks is vulnerable to the impacts of how some of these risks will play out. And then on the opportunity side, what we also see is that obviously everybody's heard that there's accelerating consumer demand for plant proteins, right? And so plant-based foods have grown something like by 43% in the last 2 years, 9 times faster than total food sales. And we absolutely believe that sort of protein diversification and moving into a sort of low carbon product portfolio critical for food companies to meet their sustainability targets. And so from our perspective, investors and companies that aren't paying attention to those trends, A, both miss out on the opportunity to de-risk their supply chains, but B, also are missing out on some really phenomenal growth opportunities. Sort of an example of this is Dean Foods, which was once America's largest dairy company, which declared bankruptcy in late 2019, primarily because of, part of the reason was because of, a lot of their market share being stolen by plant-based milk. So there is enormous disruptive potential there that investors should be paying attention to. So I think sort of winding it all down, or sort of in summary, I guess, what research has shown is that there is a correlation between sustainability and sort of traditional factors such as quality and volatility and so forth, and which themselves are sort of indicate resilience for companies. And so, we do think that as investors are becoming more aware that as for them to really ensure a resilient portfolio, they have to be paying attention to all these other trends, macroeconomic trends as well. I'll now pass it on, I guess, back to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much for your insight, Artie. And you mentioned the change in consumer preference. And so here to talk more about consumers is Randy. Oh, you're on mute there.
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Randy Krunthal-Sacco. I'm a senior scholar, as Kevin's mentioned, at Stern Center for Sustainable Business. By way of background, I spent, I say 25, but it really is 30 years in consumer packaged goods, running many businesses at Johnson & Johnson, where I spent over 20 years, and prior to that, Kraft Foods. My interest at Stern is around consumer purchase behavior. Lots of data around consumers' intention to purchase, but very little broad data on consumers' actual purchase behavior. And so what I'd like to talk about is some of the trends that we've seen. First, what we found looking at consumer goods, which includes food, OTC medicines, personal care, uh, um, and household products, is that sustainable products, as defined by a product that has a claim on the package suggesting that it's more sustainable than its competition, because packaging is ubiquitous. If you expect consumers to go to your website, that's just not going to happen. So that sustainable products are growing and now account for just under 20% of the market, about 17% of the market. That was a bit lower than what we had hoped. But what we found, which is really taking note, is that that 17% delivered 55% of the growth of consumer packaged goods. Typically, you'd see 17% of the market deliver about 17% of the growth, but 17% here delivered over half of the market growth. Absent these sustainable products, the market would have been relatively, the growth would have been 1%. These sustainable products also grew 7 times faster than their conventional counterparts. We also found that this year, there was a lot of debate as to whether sustainable products would fare well, as people perhaps would cede interest in sustainability and focus more on security and safety. But I'm delighted to report that that consumers have actually gone in a bigger way, and sustainable products outperformed conventional products even during the pandemic. I also found that there was a beginning of carbon labeling. So you're seeing carbon labels, brands talking about the carbon footprint of the product that they're making. This is going to be a much bigger thing in 2021, this year. In 2022, Unilever said that they're going to be carbon labeling 70,000 products. It was well over $1 billion in sales this year, just with products that had carbon labels. So that will also be an important trend. We found that consumers don't just say they're willing to pay more for sustainable products. They are paying more, and it's not harming the growth. And sustainable products are far less price sensitive. So you have an opportunity to price absent without the same impact on volume. We also found that sustainable products fare very well and differentially well among younger consumers. We hear younger consumers saying this, but they're actually voting with their pocketbook and buying more sustainable products. This is the future consumer. And then finally, we did look at what's happening in e-commerce as the business is moving far more from bricks and mortar to e-commerce. And we found that sustainable products are significantly outperforming in e-commerce relative to bricks and mortar. This isn't surprising, because you'd imagine that the demographic of the sustainable purchaser is very similar to the online purchaser. But I would also say that the manufacturers and retailers have much more real estate to communicate the sustainable supply chains of their products. And also retailers have, as I think was noted by Ewan earlier today, have committed to promoting and highlighting the more sustainable counterpart. Finally, I do sit on the board of GlobeScan, and what we are learning from GlobeScan is that consumers are expecting that manufacturers and retailers do the right thing. They are expecting that they engage and push a sustainable agenda forward. And if not, for a sustainable future, if not, they risk obsolescence. The other last thing as it relates to, and this study is in an exhibition piece of this website somewhere. But the other thing that I wanted to say just to close is that as it relates to resiliency, we saw particularly in the cleaning aisle that you couldn't buy kind of these more chemical type products. And what was there, if there was any availability, was kind of the 7th generation or the Method or the Greenworks. But the good news is these are now purchased and in people's households. So to the extent that we want trial of those products and they deliver, this is going to be really encouraging. And those, my expectation is continues to be that sustainable products are our future.
Thank you, Randy. And as Randy mentioned, her report is, if you go on the Pathable page, you'll see a files tab in this meeting, and you can get the report there now or at any point during the summit. So we've got about 10 minutes left. Randy, I'll throw it back to you for our second question, that as we talk about resiliency, it's about the future. So what do you think, what changes would you like to see from a consumer perspective, or companies addressing their consumers in the future, and maybe what are we not ready for?
I should stop turning myself on mute. Good question, Kevin. Thank you. I would like to see far greater transparency in communication. I would like for retailers help consumers navigate this and communicate the more sustainable practices. I can't tell you how many times I did not see sustainable communications on brands that I know engage in sustainable supply chain. So it's a real opportunity for you to make sure that you're telling the consumer what you're doing because they care. Second, when you tell them about the products, I think there's kind of what I've seen is kind of two ends. Either everybody talks sustainability and forgets to tell the consumer that these products work or they taste good, or conversely, they only tell them that they work and taste good and forget to tell them about the supply chain. So please do both, because people are buying your product for the category reason for being, whether it be taste or performance, et cetera. But they want to know that you're doing that in a more sustainable way. So big opportunity there. And then the third thing I would say is that legacy brands, so brands that have been around for a while, you need to start to tell consumers about your sustainable supply chains, or start to adopt sustainable supply chains. There's too much risk not doing anything. I think there's risk of alienation, but there's lots of ways to test for alienation. Please start to bring those legacy brands into today's world and start, or you'll be a Dean's Food, as Artie says, or you'll be out of business, or Chapter 11. In terms of what we're not ready for, we're certainly never ready for consumer boycotts, which absolutely happen. I think a lot of times we're not ready for transformation. If you're in a category that hasn't seen transformation around sustainability, you will. I've seen many categories upended in just the past couple of years by small companies that come in and transform the category because they've brought a sustainable innovation into the category. So complacency is not sustainable. And then I guess the third area is around regulation. I competed in the skincare category for a long time. Feinstein threatened, and I use that word generously because I supported her work, or kindly, I should say, cosmetic regulation. And so what happened is the industry got together, all the big players that normally don't talk got together and figured out a way to get parabens out of the product and get phthalates out of the product and formaldehyde releasers out of the product. All these are good for the world and good for human health, and has resulted in really strong performance around the companies that have engaged in that way. Thank
you so much. Great advice. Artie, to you, and I know Ewan has thrown in a sub question about, in particular, maybe the difference between plant-based and lab-grown meat in terms of what might happen in the future.
I think Ewan's question is, what is the outlook of plant-based? I mean, I think they'll all play a role. I mean, the fact is right now only plant-based has been commercialized, but we're seeing a lot of like price parity build between plant-based and their conventional counterparts. But similarly, on the cell-based meat side, we've seen dramatic drop in costs at least as reported by some of these companies. So I think the cell-based in terms of commercialization, primarily because also they need more consumer acceptance, sort of better regulatory structures, etc., will take a couple of years to come to market. Though you've got some bits and sort of pilots here and there in Singapore and places like that, but I think it'll be a while before it sort of is able to compete at the same level as conventional meat. I think it'll take a while to get to the same cost or price point at least, though it is trending down. Just on your previous question very quickly, I think the one thing that I'd like to see personally change is the sort of evolution from moving from we do good to actually sort of moving to this principle of we do good and we do no significant harm. You're seeing that now being adopted by the EU taxonomy, right? So, I mean, there is this idea that, because the idea of we do good, I mean, every company does something, adds value, right? It adds value to somebody somewhere. I worked for the energy sector. I worked for ExxonMobil. I mean, in the oil sector, absolutely has been critical to economic development. But I think so, sort of marrying that principle of we do good with we do no significant harm it has to be how sustainability and progresses towards a more resilient future. I think without that, then you end up having a very isolated way of looking at some of these issues.
Thank you, Artie. Kelly?
Yeah, so I'll end by just saying a lot of what I'm going to talk about goes into greater detail in the report that we did with Kevin and TSC. I'll flag that TCFD especially has shown us that energy, transportation, buildings, agriculture, food, forest product sectors, those are the ones that are going to have the biggest impacts from climate change, but the trickle down from there, those sectors affect everyone. So I really recommend the report. I really like the way it talks about two strategies of bridging and buffering when it comes to a resilient supply chain. I would say that a great company needs to do both. I lived through working in the automotive sector when I saw the effects of the Japanese tsunami we had one factory that created one thing for us and a bunch of other automotive makers in one country. So I really got what you guys were getting at, Kevin, in the report of bridging and buffering. So I talk to our clients about that a lot. I also really love this idea of creating a high reliability culture. And that's what I was talking about earlier. It's not just your suppliers, it's your executives on down through your employees, and even to Randy's point, your customers. And then because I've been on this evolution as being in a bank for 5 years now, 6 years, think about partners you haven't tapped to help you achieve your ESG goals. I went from 5 years ago talking to our clients who were surprised that their bank was even talking to them about sustainable finance, and that I was talking to sustainability people at a client who didn't even know who their CFO was, never spoke to their treasury regularly, to now I'm usually in the room with both at the same time. And it's a tremendous difference. So think about, I would encourage sustainability teams at companies to stop thinking they're alone and they're this ancillary department over here. You need to demand the resources and the support that you can have at your disposal, including your banks like HSBC. And then lastly, I'll just say, and I loved what Randy said about repeating yourself, repeating the same messages over and over again. Your executives should be repeating it. Your people doing investor relations already, right, should be repeating the same messages over and over again. And absolutely, I work with clients that are doing such great things in sustainability and they don't tell anyone. And then unfortunately, I also see products all the time that talk about it. And when you dig even a layer deep, it's not impressive what they're doing. So I loved what Randy said, marry them all together and keep talking to us and others about the E and the S, because don't forget that sustainable finance is not just about solving your GHG emissions problems.
Thank you so much. We do have one question that's nerdy enough for me to talk about because I love warehouses. So there's a question from the audience around resilient supply chains and warehouses. And I will say that, I think that we have all collectively learned that when you hyper optimize a supply chain for its context, it makes it less adaptable. And of course, the kind of toilet paper challenge that we had in our inventory supply with the B2C and B2B supply chains being separated and not transferable was at the root of that problem, and many more. And so I think we're going to relook at our lessons learned from an inventory management standpoint here. And we're going to find that there's a better sweet spot where we perhaps don't optimize every single supply chain by itself, but think more systemically about how those operate and how any given supply chain can act as a form of resilience, a form of backup inventory, a form of buffering for others if we think about it. So I want to thank our panel here for helping us get kicked off on Tuesday of the summit, and I wish you all well the rest of the day. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you very much.
Bye.
Bye.